Good afternoon. Final seminar of the Global Security Seminar Series by Near East Institute. My name is Mustafa Çıraklı, and I'm the director of the Institute. Today, once trying to delve into a rather topical discussion, try to make sense of an important discussion, and that is the feature of democracy. Now, this has been this is an important discussion that has been happening for quite some time. If you look at Europe, the discussion takes place or revolves around the rise of the far right or the populist and anti-systemic parties. We started this sort of a rise gathering pace, especially following the Greek financial crisis of 2008-2009, but it is getting to a worrying extent. More recently, we've seen in Portugal, once again, the far right there making significant gains in their recent legislative elections. If you look at Africa too, although this discussion on democracy is much infused, of course, with anti-democracies, the recent takeovers in several countries has also brought this discussion on top of the global. And of course, there's the US. If you look at what's happening across the pond, first, the worrying trend was with regards to the Tea Party, and led to, of course, Donald Trump winning the election. There was a brief respite, if I may dare to say, but once the election year and Donald Trump has a very good once again the US elections, and that of course also brings to question what may happen as to democracy. Now, to discuss these and many more issues that are relevant to this discussion, we have one of the foremost leading experts on democracy, and that is of course Professor Nic Cheeseman, who is here with us this afternoon. Welcome, Nic. Now, before I give the floor to you, before I give the floor to our distinguished speaker, I want to tell you a little bit about his background. And I should probably stress this, that Nic has impeccable academic credentials. He is a professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham and the director of the Center of Elections, Democracy, Accountability and Representation, CEDAR there. He was formerly the director of the African Studies Center at the University of Oxford. And I should say that Nic mainly works on democracy and development, including a range of topics: election rigging, political campaigning, corruption, and presidential rule. The articles he's published based on this research have won a number of prestigious awards, including the Giga Award for the Best Article in Comparative Area Studies and the Frank Cass Award for the Best Article that was published in the prestigious Journal of Democratization in 2015. Now, Professor Cheeseman is also the author or the editor of more than 10 books, including How to Rig an Election, that was published in 2018, selected as one of the books of the year by the Spectator magazine. Recognition of this academic and public contribution, the Political Studies Association, Nic, the prestigious Johnny Lewandowski, Prize for Outstanding Person to 2019. In recent years, he's also won the Celebrating Impact Prize of the ESRC, the UK body. A frequent commentator on democracy, elections, and global events, Professor Cheeseman's analysis has appeared in many international outlets, including The Economist, Le Monde, Financial Times, Newsweek, The Washington Post, New York Times, the BBC, and the Daily Nation. And Nic also contributes and writes a regular column for the Africa Report and The Guardian. Now, many of his interviews and insights can be found on the website that he founded and co-edits, www.democracyinafrica.org. Now, without any further ado, Nic, it's such a pleasure to be hosting you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's lovely to be here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I'm hoping it's going to genuinely be a discussion. I'm hoping that I'm going to start with hopefully 30 minutes of where I see us going, and then people who are on the line from different experiences from different parts of the world will bring those experiences to bear in their questions and their comments. And one of the key things that I really want to get across today, and I think this is really important, is to start differentiating this global decline of democracy. So you did a great job, fantastic introduction, highlighting some of the key features that we might think of, some of the key countries. One of the things I really want to drive home today is that those countries are experiencing what outwardly looks to be a similar process, which is democratic decline, but for very different reasons, for very different historical contexts, and with very different implications for what it would mean to actually put those things right. And that one of the things that we really need to start doing better, I think, as people, scholars who are concerned about democracy, is actually understanding those differences so we can better understand what's happening rather than risking lumping everything into one bigger process. So the input of people on the call who might see in some of what I see their own experience in their own country be really useful. Secondly, apologies for anybody who's on the line and can hear the background music. I'm really sorry. I got stuck in traffic. I'm sat in a cafe, which enables me to be able to speak to you, which is great, but there is a bit of background noise. I'm really sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to try and bring up my PowerPoint slides, which I have here. Hopefully you can all see them. Okay, so the job today is understanding the global decline in democracy. And I just wanted to flag right at the start that I'm going to be talking in particular about some evidence that comes out of a couple of different processes and research projects recently. One is work I've done with my colleague Marie Desrosiers, which is on how not to engage with authoritarian states, a paper that we wrote for the Westminster Foundation of Democracy, and also some research I've been doing recently in collaboration with the OECD, which is looking at how we respond to development, how we respond to political challenges as a kind of development community. How does aid respond to changes in politics? So the kinds of political trends we've been talking about, declining democracy, growing authoritarianism. If people are interested, those are two good background papers to go and take a look at after the talk. Where does the data that I'm going to kind of talk about today come from? Well, OECD data from 2010 to 2021. So that's the aid data on foreign aid and how foreign aid is spent. I've also conducted interviews in a number of different countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Bangladesh, India, Armenia, Georgia, Ecuador, and Tunisia have been covered by the team. I've also read a lot of literature and we put together big reviews of the literature on how donors are responding to the rise in authoritarianism, and also personally done research in around 15 countries, listing some of them there. And so that's resulted in a number of books, many of which have been on the issue of democracy or authoritarianism, some in Africa, but also some well beyond, including Democracy in Africa and, of course, How to Rig an Election, which we're just preparing for a new volume for this year to celebrate the year of elections, or as it might be, to commiserate the year of elections. So based on all of that research, and I'll try and draw on it as I go, but that's the kind of evidence base that I'm going to speak from, I want to make 5 key points for you today. First, I think we need to differentiate the decline in democracy. We need to understand that the reasons it's happening are different in different places. Second, I think we need to understand that the last 5 years have really seen a step change in the threat to democracy as a result of the changing international context. And therefore, things are not just getting bad, but they're perhaps getting worse in some ways at a faster rate. Third, I think we need to understand that growing autocratization is a threat to security as well as human rights. This is often pitched, obviously, as a threat to democracy, as a threat to human rights and civil liberties, but it's also a threat to the security of democracies themselves, and I'll try and explain why that is. Fourth, I think it's really important that we understand that this isn't simply about the role of China and Russia around the world, that the threat that authoritarian states pose to democracies is coming from a much broader, bigger range of authoritarian states than ever before, and that is something that we really need to think about carefully and not simply rely on these two global superpowers as kind of the proxies for all authoritarianism in a very simplified kind of understanding of how this process is unfolding at the global level. And finally, I think there's an urgent need to really, rethink how we go about as an international community, if we care about democracy, trying to defend democratic values and reduce the extent to which we see this rise of authoritarianism across the world. So why do we need to differentiate the threat to democracy? Let's start with the very basics. We know that the number of authoritarian states has increased over the last 15, 20 years. And we know that authoritarian states have been learning from one another and innovating between each other. So we see things like anti-NGO legislation, for example, being introduced in one authoritarian state and then passed on to others. In that example, the Russian Foreign Agent Act, for example, was then copied in various different ways in many different countries around the world. We now have over 100 attempts to introduce anti-civil society or anti-NGO legislation that would constrain the activities of civic organizations since then. So significant episodes of opposition learning and authoritarian learning, authoritarian innovation, but also this overall story of democratic decline. And what you can see in the graph here is from Freedom House, the number of countries moving towards authoritarianism, the number of countries moving towards democracy every year from 2005 to 2020. And as you can see there, every year there's more countries moving the wrong way as far as democracy is concerned, rather than the right way. In terms of just the last couple of years, what do we see? Well, the year of elections is risking becoming, of course, the year of controversies. We have controversy over hate speech and divisive rhetoric in the Indian elections. We have concerns about the United States election for similar reasons. We also have serious concerns about some of the elections that are being held in places like sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the problems this year is that we're having more elections more people voting in elections perhaps than ever before, billions of people around the world in a bumper year of elections. And yet actually what that's focusing on us is not so much people's ability to actually go out there and affect change, but rather the ability of leaders to manipulate elections and the problem of elections being very fragile and vulnerable to that manipulation, something that I wrote about in How to Rig an Election. It's important to note, of course, that there was some criticism of the treatment of this trend, especially by policy groups. So Ling and Metal have published a paper in which they suggest a different thing. They suggest that actually we haven't seen the decline in democracy that some people have cited, looking, for example, at things like the margin of victory for ruling parties, and they provide a cautionary note. And I think that's a valuable cautionary note because, we need to remember that we also often see in one continent, for example, one country moving away from democracy and another one moving back towards it. So Malawi and Zambia moved towards democracy during the COVID pandemic in Africa, two of the only countries in the world to move back towards democracy. So it's important not to lose sight of that and not to exaggerate the trends. But nonetheless, it seems fairly clear to me, from my experience on the ground and also from the democracy ratings organizations, that we have this significant process of erosion of democracy. But it's important to think about why that's happening. And one of the things that I've written about recently is the risk of what we've called it's sort of time fallacy, the fallacy of thinking that because everything's happening at the same time, it's happening for the same reason, that all of these different processes of de-democratization are actually being driven by the very same set of factors. And it's clearly not true. If you think about what's happening in somewhere like North America, in America, for example, we see a country that has been an established democracy and having been relatively successful economically, now struggling on both counts to an extent. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, we're actually not talking about high-quality democracies moving backwards in some cases. We're more talking about established authoritarian regimes becoming more authoritarian and becoming stronger and gaining tighter control. So kind of authoritarian strengthening, really, rather than democratic backsliding, because democratic backsliding implies that countries were once a high-quality democracy that moved away from that. In many cases, that's not really what we're seeing. We're actually seeing authoritarian states getting stronger. So in order to try and move away from this overview that everything is moving in the same way for the same reasons, we decided to try and really break this down. And this comes out of work with my CEDAR group at the University of Birmingham. Everybody in that group has played into some of this thinking. So just wanted to acknowledge that. So that means, we've started to think about, okay, what are the different ways we've seen countries move away from democracy in the last 4 years? Well, one is violent overthrow. Obviously, in places like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, we've seen coups, etc. And that's a violent process that removes ostensibly a democratic state, at least a civilian state. In many cases, those civilian states that undermine their own democratic credentials through things like electoral manipulation, but a violent process of transition. We also, though, see very different processes. So, for example, we also see processes where it's not the sitting president being overthrown by the military, but the sitting president themselves extending power through what we call here an executive power grab, undermining checks and balances, removing presidential term limits, attacking or subverting checks and balances institutions, and so on. So those are two key, very different pathways. We also then have put down two others here: polarization. So by that we mean the kind of rise of liberal forces, the fall in tolerance, the less agreement between different factions, different parties, different individuals on what the truth is, and the greater use of kind of divisive language in elections. And then also state capture, the subversion of democratic institutions by private individuals and institutions. In other words, subverting and taking the state, the legislature, the judiciary, etc., the treasury, and actually making sure that they serve a small number of private ends, hollowing those institutions out, and actually having unelected officials taking much more power, rather than power being concentrated in the hands of one president. So these are four different processes. Now, they might happen at the same time in some cases. So we might see that polarization actually goes hand in hand with an executive power grab. We often see an executive power grab going hand in hand with state capture, because once presidents have no constraints, they start to do things which undermine the institutions by bringing in private individuals, stealing more money, and that exposes countries to state capture. So we're not suggesting that these four pathways are in any way exclusive. Many of them can be combined. But what we are suggesting is that it's useful to start thinking about which of these might be taking place in different countries for two particular reasons. Now, one of those is that we think this identifies distinctive risks. In other words, each pathway is actually connected to a certain kind of risk that perhaps tells us something important about the way that process is likely to play out. So, for example, violent overthrows lead to new authoritarian juntas. In some cases, they don't want to move back to democracy and delay the democratic transition. There's also perhaps an increased risk of human rights violations and conflict once the military takes power, if it decides to retain power in an extremely repressive way. Polarization also has its own distinct sets of risks and issues. We've often seen, for example, growing attacks on ethnic and sexual minorities. We've seen increasing reluctance to accept women's rights and pushback and rollback of women's rights in some areas. And of course, the act of polarization can generate societal tension that itself can generate conflict and violence. But again, that's a very different type of conflict and violence to the kind that's generated by a military coup. Executive power grabs also have some distinctive risks here, we think. For example, the exclusion of opposition groups and civil society groups, this gradual slide perhaps towards dictatorship, the way that it can become extremely difficult to actually work with institutions of the government in order to affect positive change. And on state capture side, some of the biggest risks are really big corruption that has a massive effect on public services and upsets and disenfranchises citizens, and a kind of hollowing out of the state, so that the state looks like it's doing a good job, but actually under the surface, it's no longer functioning for its own citizens. And of course, because we see these distinctive pathways actually giving us some information on the process and on the risks, it also then enables us to do a little bit of work on trying to identify distinctive responses. So what are the things we might do in the case of coups? Well, potentially, obviously, reinforce anti-coup norms, strengthen regional organizations, but also things like, addressing coup conditions. Why are coups happening? Do we need to be harder on election rigging? Because sometimes coups happen after a rigged election, when the president has been undermined and the legitimacy has been undermined by electoral manipulation. When it comes to polarization, obviously one of the things we would then need to do is to think about building social capital and trust, building communities, brokering talks between different groups, trying to break down those echo chambers that might have developed, strengthening the role of moderates in bringing people together at the table. When it comes to executive power grabs, there's also, again, a set of distinctive things that we might need to do. We might think, for example, about investing in and strengthening the independence of the judiciary and the legislature to try and preemptively make them stronger so that they're less easy to erode if we think that executive power grab is one of the main things we might worry about in a particular country. And finally, on state capture, might really want to promote things around financial transparency, support investigative journalism, and so on, to enable some of the things that are happening on the ground to actually be exposed so citizens understand what's happening with their money and to their state. So that's a little bit about how we need to start differentiating between different processes. And of course, different of those processes might be happening in different regions. So the coups so far mainly been confined to Africa and West Africa. I would say polarization is perhaps something that we've seen in Latin America, Europe, parts of Asia, North America, so maybe perhaps a broader one, and also, of course, around executive power grab. Again, something that we've seen fairly broadly across a number of countries, but perhaps something that's easier to do in countries that start off not being so democratic, and therefore something that has been particularly common in those newer democracies that are less institutionalized. So we might, on the one hand, want to think about this in terms of those particular pathways and a theoretical way of differentiating the decline of democracy. Might also want to think about potentially whether there are certain regional and geographic variations in that as well. So why has there been a step change? Well, I think probably over the last 5-10 years, we've seen China and Russia move closer to something that we might call autocracy promotion. This has been a really big debate in the literature. We've had some people suggesting that, there has been autocracy promotion like the West has promoted democracy in the past. Other people have been suspicious of that. They've suggested that actually authoritarian states are often more pragmatic. They're not always promoting a particular vision. They don't necessarily have the kind of ideological background to the promotion that you would want to see if you really wanted to say that they had a sort of agenda of systematically promoting that. But I think what we've probably seen over the last 5-10 years is a significant ramping up of that, both in terms of China around President Xi and actually, the explicit promotion of a more kind of explicit ideology of his within China and legislated for within China, but also then pushing that out through foreign policy. And also, of course, with Russia in terms of its expansionary interests, not only in its own theater in terms of thinking about Ukraine, etc., but also in terms of sub-Saharan Africa in those post-coup countries. And therefore, we seem to be seeing a significantly more assertive, engaged, and systematic attempt to promote authoritarian values around the world. I think there are two related but different threats that we want to cover here. One is, the overall global balance of power. We are now getting to a point where we will be seeing, for example, if current trends continue, more authoritarian states in the world than democracies. And certainly in certain regions of the world, we will be seeing far more authoritarian states than democracies. So democracies risk becoming a minority concern. And obviously being a democracy in a very authoritarian neighborhood might present certain challenges to sustaining the quality of that democracy, which I'll talk more about in a moment. Secondly, of course, one of the things I think is important is that as that shifts, as we start to see more and more authoritarian states in the world, one of the issues we face is that the rules of the game might start to change, that authoritarians will use their growing numbers in international institutions as a way of being able to actually change those institutional rules, for example, by making it harder to condemn human rights abuses or by changing the way that we talk about human rights so that instead of human rights being defined in terms of liberty and so on, they're defined more in terms of development, something that therefore is much easier for authoritarian states to respond to. I think it's also important to note that this process that I'm talking about here, this global process of kind of promoting authoritarian values, is happening in a number of different ways. So one of those is, getting into and controlling regional organizations, either leaving democratic regional organizations or actually trying to take over regional organizations and make them more authoritarian by weakening their support for democracy and human rights. But we also see this being underpinned in a more general sense by very high levels of corruption, transnational corruption, something that Transparency International has kind of referred to as corruption as statecraft, state building through corruption, foreign policy through corruption. So here I'm thinking about, for example, well-known cases of China being accused of funneling money to political parties and leaders in Australia, Russia being accused of funding Marine Le Pen in France and other countries. So essentially the use of corrupt networks and illicit networks to funnel money, dirty money, to politicians in democratic states in order to support Russia, China, etc's position on certain things. Sometimes that is to adopt their position with respect to sort of important issues for them on the international agenda. Some of that is designed to reduce criticism of abuses. So a classic example in that sense was what we saw with Azerbaijan, what's been called the Azerbaijani laundromat, where something like 2.6 billion is said to have been cycled through different countries, including the UK, through shell companies so that it can be put into the hands of politicians to reduce the criticism of European bodies of the human rights abuses going on in Azerbaijan. So there's an important point here, which is that this is having an impact on democracy, but these processes are also corroding democracy in Western states that think of themselves as being established democracies, and is facilitating a wider process of corruption and international financial illicit transactions that have an impact on the level of corruption and the level of governance in those other states. So why is this a problem for everyone? Well, I think I previewed that really nicely with what I just said about the way in which this is actually leading to transnational corruption that might be undermining governance and other standards around the world. But let me just also provide a slightly different perspective. One, of course, is that we know that authoritarian states often generate big challenges for development. On average, for example, authoritarian states tend to grow slower than democracies. Some estimate around 20% GDP over 20 years. We know that they're more likely to suffer from conflict and instability, which means they may be more likely to cause migration flows, which of course is one of the big challenges that Western states are currently trying to manage. We also know from this sort of report, so I put the Case for Democracy report here from the Varieties of Democracy project, that authoritarian states on average are less likely to deliver on their education and climate change promises than democratic states. At the same time, we also know that authoritarian states are more likely to engage in disinformation and foster terrorist networks, and they're more likely to break international deals and norms. So in lots of different ways, authoritarian states actually represent a major challenge to the world's democracies. Even if we weren't concerned about authoritarianism infecting democracy and undermining the quality of democracy in those remaining democratic states, we should be concerned that some of the big tasks that we have, reducing poverty around the world, reducing corruption, reducing disinformation, dealing effectively with refugee flows, etc., will be made worse by a significant increase in the number of authoritarian states. Why is this all not about China and Russia? Well, China and Russia are clearly important. They are very important, very significant, very high-profile states. But in some cases, I think we focus a little bit too much on Russia and we miss how big and how broad the movement of authoritarian states is. So let me just give you a quick example. If we think about the scope of Russia's investment in the world, its GDP is about 1.8 trillion. That's half of the GDP of India. It's on a par with the GDP of Spain. What that means is that Russia's capacity right now to actually be able to do some of the things we're talking about on a global scale is often exaggerated. China, of course, is much more significant and has many more resources, but even China does not completely determine how other authoritarian states act. And so the image that we're often given of China and Russia kind of orchestrating a united authoritarian campaign against democracy is horribly oversimplified. In reality, there are many countries out there in the world that at different points have been involved in promoting authoritarianism or reducing the quality of democracy in their neighborhoods that are well beyond China and Russia. We could think about countries like Turkey, countries like Ethiopia under Bolsonaro, countries like Brazil. And in many of these cases, these are fairly significant countries with fairly significant income, wealth in their regions, and although they're not global superpowers, they are able to be regionally influential. And at the same time, and I think this is a really important point, they have their own agency. They don't see themselves as pawns of Putin or Xi. They have their own ideas about how they want to cultivate their own position in the world. And so they can't simply be reduced to a kind of global understanding of a Cold War in which there's a set of authoritarian states on one side and a set of democracies on the other. The situation is much more complex than that, much more unpredictable as a result of that. So 5, why do we need to see a more strategic response? And why do we need international donors, Western donors who are thinking about democracy and trying to protect it to adopt a more strategic response? Well, I think one of the things that's perhaps true is that although there have been summits for democracy and there is a growing understanding of the threats to democracy around the world, I think we don't necessarily fully understand the magnitude of the challenge that's being posed to democracy and also to our own security. And I also think we haven't fully developed a rigorous, systematic response to that yet. Some of the evidence for that comes from the OECD figures that I was mentioning earlier. So here you can see in the graph that the countries that are authoritarian in the world are taking up significantly greater aid than in the past, and countries that are democracies are getting significantly less aid than in the past. Now, this isn't simply because everyone wants to fund authoritarian states. It's partly because there are simply more authoritarian states. And so if you're going to try and do humanitarian work and development work everywhere, you're naturally going to end up spending more money in authoritarian regions. But one of the things I think it does cause us to think about is, how are we spending things like aid money? To what extent is that being leveraged to generate a positive effect when it comes to democracy or slowing down the authoritarian tide? Are we actually seeing a genuinely integrated international response to some of these challenges? And again, just to, give you a sense of what some of the OECD research suggests, one of the things we've seen is a really big increase in humanitarian aid over the last 10, 20 years, in part because of the growing number of global challenges, in part because authoritarian states often generate major humanitarian crises that democracies then have to try and respond to. But one of the things that means is that we're not seeing an increase in the types of aid on which donors actually gain more traction. So humanitarian aid is often something in which there's very little political traction because it's given in a humanitarian way. It's explicitly not supposed to have political conditions attached to it. It's given to individuals in desperate need, and it's not something that's negotiated with governments as a result. That means that if you're spending an increasing amount of your aid through a humanitarian lens, rather than using democracy aid or development aid as a way of trying to prevent those problems from emerging in the first place, you are putting the cart after the horse, but also B, you're getting into a situation where you might be actually over time underestimating your own leverage and your own ability to use aid as a way of encouraging greater democratization. So what are my take-home points? And I'll leave it with this. I think, one, democracy is going to decline further around the world if more is not done to protect it. We will be living in a more authoritarian state in 5 years' time than we are now, and I think that is actually quite terrifying. I think that will make democracies less safe and less secure, and the impact of this on democracies themselves, on established democracies themselves, has often been underestimated. I think it's going to have a significant and profound effect both on their security and on their quality of democracy. I think it's going to also, of course, result and an increase in major global challenges. We're going to see more disinformation, we're going to see more migration, and we need a more effective response than we currently have. But at the minute, there doesn't seem to be the galvanizing force around the world in order to be able to promote that. And one of the things I think we've probably seen over the last 5-10 years is a real growing recognition that actually the people who are going to have to save democracy will not be the international community. It will be the people in each country concerned who fight and rise up to save their own democracies. Because right now, the international community is not coming to save anyone. So I hope that was useful. I know it was a very quick presentation, covered an awful lot of ground, but hopefully that means it's raised some really good questions. And I look forward to talking through those with you over the next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Professor Cheeseman, enlightening and I think and the excellent overview of the moment. Now, there are some questions coming in. Depending on the time we have, I may also ask a question or two. But let's start with the audience, shall we? So the first question is from Professor Köprülü, who is based here at the Nias University, and she's the head of politics. And her question is, can you please shed light, if possible, on what is new in terms of measures or mechanisms in sustaining authoritarian rules? She says, in the literature, there exists an argument revolving around convergence of regime types, democracy downgrading and authoritarian upgrading. I guess she is asking you to reflect on, what is how do authoritarian rules sustain themselves? I think that's still the question. If I'm not
Should mistaken. I take that one?
Yes, please.
So I think one of the things we have seen in the last few years is a kind of new form of authoritarianism emerging, right? So if you think about some of the authoritarian states in the countries that I work on in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the things we really see there is quite a lot of a focus on, we're authoritarian and we're going to deliver two things much better than the democracies that failed. One is order and stability, right? And especially in fragmented, conflict-prone societies, order and stability can be very resonant with societies. So we're going to deliver you that. And also we're going to deliver you services. We're actually going to come in and do a better job of doing development because we're hierarchical, we're efficient, we can deliver. And I think we see, elements of that in China, elements of that also in a country like Rwanda on the African continent. Modi, of course, perhaps also making similar kinds of arguments to an extent in India. So I think that there's a number of different sources of legitimacy. One is that idea of, being able to provide order and stability and therefore to have a key role as a unifier nationally. Another is obviously that role in terms of being, services and legitimacy. And if you can combine those two, you can, of course, make your authoritarian regime very popular. And you can have an authoritarian regime that, perversely, although it doesn't hold elections, might win them if it did. And of course, a lot of authoritarian regimes do hold elections, but also manipulate them to make sure they stay in power. I think one of the things, obviously, that's then underlying that is that, particularly in, for example, right-wing authoritarian states, we've also seen an attempt to mobilize support by identifying common enemies or scapegoating certain communities as a way of mobilizing support and retaining support. And one of the reasons I think that's particularly valuable for authoritarian leaders is that in most cases they don't survive, they don't manage to provide a good service over a long period of time. So again, if you go back to the economic figures, Rwanda is a great example of a successful authoritarian
I think we are having a small technical difficulty with Professor Cheeseman. I think he may have lost his internet connection. I'm sure he will be trying to join us in the next minute or two. But what I can do, I can tell you a little bit about what I want Nic to reflect for us, and hopefully I will be able to pose my question. And then the question relates to the way Western countries, in particular, have in the past tried to promote democracy. Now, of course, this is a concept that is highly charged, because we know that democracy promotion bears its own perils, in the sense that, sorry, just I was reading some messages from our director as well in the meantime. It bears its own perils. I mean, let's all remember when the US decided to invade Iraq. The leadership at the time, the US leadership at the time, used this argument. It wasn't just the argument or the perception of threat. Of course, there was that. Tony Blair, George Bush's counterpart in Britain too, argued that Saddam Hussein possessed these weapons of mass destruction, and that he was prepared and ready to use them. But together with this argument, there was also the idea of taking democracy to the Middle East, starting with Afghanistan, then with Iraq. So it is a rather charged concept, but it is nonetheless important for this discussion, because this sort of way of democracy promotion still, we see it still, sorry, just double checking in the meantime the messages from our director. It does still feature in many policy papers, and it does still feature and shape policymaking in certain international institutions too. such as the European Union, which has a particular relevance for us here in Cyprus and for our immediate neighborhood as well. So that was going to be my question to Professor Cheeseman, what he thinks of this idea of democratization by Western, whether that's worthy of pursuing, or whether democracy should take root at the more domestic level, because this is something that he also emphasized just before we lost connection. He was saying that it should be the people in those countries who should be able to defend democracy. So I think here we go. Nic is back. So if we can just let's ask the director to reconnect.
Sorry, everyone. I'm in Nairobi and the line isn't perfect. It just cut out, so it took me a minute to get it back again. Sorry about that. Should we go on to the next question?
Yes. What I was doing, Nic, while we lost you, I was just saying that, I wanted to ask you a question about this notion or the concept of democracy promotion. That we used to hear a lot of this. I took the audience back to the early 2000s when we had the Afghanistan war and the invasion of Iraq. We had George Bush. He was using this idea of taking democracy to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to the wider Middle East. But it's not something that disappeared. And over the years, we see this featuring again and again in different policy papers. Actors, the European Union is a relevant actor for us here in Cyprus, neighborhood too. The EU, to some extent, also, at least in theory, foreign policy or dealing and engagement with other countries on this idea of strengthening democracy, if not democracy promotion. So I was wondering what your take is on this idea of Western-style democracy promotion.
Absolutely. I think there's two things to say here, right? One is democracy promotion should never have been about trying to impose values on other people. That kind of colonial thinking is never going to work for a number of reasons. We know that democracy is only sustainable if it's built from within. And I think one of the really important things is that a country's people actually feel democratic ownership, feel that they are actually sacrificing for democracy to get that democratic founding myth that then you can rely on in future when your democracy gets into problems. So the idea that democracy can be supplied from outside, I think, is a total fallacy. I think what democracy promotion should have been about, and hopefully in the future might be about, is listening to people on the ground and supporting their own struggles to make their own future and their own history. So listening to activists, democracy people, the people that are on the streets in many countries around the world trying to resist corruption, trying to promote better forms of government, whether that's about service delivery or human rights. That's what I think, is worth supporting, because that's supporting people actually winning their own battles and then being able to gain better political systems for themselves. What I think is dangerous is that, in an attempt to counteract the kind of colonial thinking of the past, there's been naturally a kind of deep critique of the idea of democracy promotion to sort of suggest that there should be no interference whatsoever in any other countries, that Western countries or democracies should simply sit on their hands and allow authoritarian abuses to take place. Personally, that's not where I go with that line of argument. I don't think that's the logical conclusion, because I think if you do that, what you actually end up doing in many cases is enabling governments that, you know, have often been brought into place, partly because of those problematic historical processes, to abuse their own people with no comeback. And I think when you talk to people on the ground in almost all of those countries, they don't want the international community to leave them alone. They actually want the international community to support them and enable them to actually, you know, generate better futures. So I think democracy promotion has a very checkered history. It's been very problematic. Countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, we've demonstrated the extent to which it can't be done overnight or from outside. But there is perhaps a way of doing something more constructive in partnership where you're strengthening existing voices from within. That does mean, I think, that you need to think quite carefully about, you know, what you're doing and where you're doing it. There might be places where there's clearly a strong, powerful domestic constituency for democracy that merits support, and other places where it seems much harder to bring that about, and perhaps doing so would involve a greater imposition of external values. And I think that's one of the things that perhaps the international community needs to start thinking about more carefully as well moving forwards.
Just on that note, with regard, well, I do agree to a large extent on, you know, giving more support to grassroots, strengthening those efforts from the bottom up in terms of strengthening democracy in particular contexts. But where I sort of get a bit skeptic is with the idea of strengthening civil society. Mainly, in some cases, we do see that genuine civil society actors, they start getting into that sort of circle or the cycle of from donors. We then start witnessing what other people have called NGOization. In other words, civil society actors becoming NGOs and becoming pegs, if you like, on this sort of a cycle of just receiving the funds, but not having any sort of impact at the ground level. I don't know if you agree with this account, but I'm aware of some interesting research coming out from the Balkans in that regard, where this was happening. Of course, it was happening in the context of state building, but I wonder if that's been your experience in some of these settings that you've been to, or when you talk with different stakeholders. I don't know if there's a similar sentiment with regards to civil society.
I think there can be, and I've certainly seen programs where I don't think we've helped in terms of the international community. I think if you push a lot of money through civil society organizations, partly because you don't want to put money through governments that you think are authoritarian and corrupt, one of the things you risk doing is setting those civil society organizations up as the enemy of the government, in the eyes of the government, right? As a problem for the government, as a problem for certain parts of society. That can have quite a divisive effect on civil society itself, generating internal divisions within civil society. But also, I think, you know, at the very beginning, I talked about the foreign agents law in Russia and the way in which we've seen the introduction of very problematic legislation around civil society in many parts of the world. I think that was a direct response to the idea that international donors were funding civil society groups to hold governments accountable. And so in a sense, we might almost have to say that perhaps there was an element to which, you know, we helped to create the problem by setting civil society up in that way. I think it's also really important to think about how do you make civil society sustainable and domestically owned and popular. So, you know, we don't want a civil society anywhere in the world that's sustained by international donors that isn't sustainable domestically, that isn't rooted in domestic social structures and processes. And I think one of the things that perhaps we haven't been very good at as an international community is really focusing on enabling that homegrown set of civil society organizations that's less dependent on our money, that we empower more to be able to do things that perhaps, you know, we don't always completely agree with. I think the other thing that, sorry, I've got a helicopter coming overhead. The other thing that perhaps, you know, we might want to talk more about in the future is there's been an awful lot of support for civil society organizations, perhaps not so much for social movements. One of the things that people I know in social movements would say is that civil society organizations often turn out to become, you know, quite professionalized, almost stabilizing forces, not always wanting to rock the boat. and they see themselves in the social movements as being the cutting edge. Donors don't tend to fund social movements because they don't have the kind of structures that enable them to actually track the money, and therefore the sort of financial challenges and others. But I do think, you know, that's a big issue for a lot of people in the civil society space, that maybe the money isn't flowing to the organizations doing the most interesting work. So I think it's a really interesting and important thing to think about. I think the other thing, though, the very final thing I would say is that I think, you know, sometimes we are overly critical of what's been done, partly because we don't always see the good that it does. And I would say, for example, that, you know, I've seen some really interesting work that's hopefully going to come out soon in our book series for Oxford University Press that suggests that, you know, one of the processes of that strengthening of NGOs has been more people moving from the NGO scene into more politics. And in some countries that has strengthened legislative scrutiny, and it has actually led to improvements in government policy. So I think I hear all of those concerns very, very keenly, but I also think that there is perhaps a way to provide that support in a more constructive, sustainable, long-term, locally owned way, and there might be many benefits to doing so.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nic. I am being told that that's all the time we have for today. Now, I really did enjoy this discussion. It was definitely a fascinating chat, which highlighted some of those key issues that we definitely have to take into account when we talk about democracy and, of course, the future of it. And I'm sure the audience will also agree with me that it was definitely eye-opening in many ways. So, Professor Cheeseman, Nic, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. I wish we had more time, but perhaps we can have the next round in person here in Cyprus, maybe. That's definitely something.
That's what I was looking for. That's what I was looking for. The invitation for the physical meeting. Yes. So yeah,
Absolutely.
Next year, same time, same place, but different format. And I would love to.
Fantastic.
For the technical difficulties, but it was lovely to talk to you, and yes, absolutely. See you next year.
It's a deal on our end. So fantastic. Thank you, Professor Cheeseman, and thank you to our audience for watching us. So please do follow the Institute on our social media to stay up to date with all our research, but also upcoming events. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Hayat hızla akıyor ve biz bu hızı seviyoruz. Her güne heyecanla başlıyor, her anı doya doya yaşıyoruz. İlk günkü heyecanımızla yılları aşıyoruz. Zaman akarken biz de kendimizi arıyoruz. Heyecanla, merakla. Sen de kendini mi arıyorsun? O zaman zamana yetiş. Bu sadece kendini bulmakla ilgili değil. Asıl heyecan kendini yaratmakta. Bir şeyler mi yaratmak istiyorsun? Mükemmel. Metali işlemeyi, bir bina yapmayı, bir iş kurmayı, hatta bir şehir kurmayı öğren. Hayat kurtarmak, teknoloji geliştirmek, üretmek. Hepsi burada. Ve burada tüm deneyimler profesyonellerle yan yana. Ancak hızlı ilerlemeliyiz. Çünkü bugün şimdi gerçekleşiyor ve yarın çok yakın. Hayatta öne geçmek istiyorsan önce zamanın önüne geçeceksin. Hep ileri gideceksin. Bu Doktor Suat İrfan Günsel. Tanıyor musun? Onun da söylediği gibi. Üniversiteler toplumların dokuma tezgahıdır. Toplumları geliştirir, dönüştürür ve gelişmesini sağlar. O burayı bugünden yarına hazırlamak için kurdu. Senin için, ileriye gitmek için. Yana ya da geriye değil. Sadece ileri. Çünkü gelecek çok yakın. Hadi harekete geç. Fikirlerin ne kadar ileride olursa yarına o kadar yaklaşırsın. Yanındakileri de geleceğe taşırsın. Bu senin geleceğin, senin fırsatın şimdi. Hadi yarın yakın. Hepimizi ileriye götür.